Welcome to European Union Governance and Policy Challenges, an online training from the University of Washington. This training was co-funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union and was produced by the Center for West European Studies and the EU Center, a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence in the University of Washington's Jackson School of International Studies. Okay, we're here today to talk about the institutions of the European Union. It's a little bit different than what many of us here in the US are used to, so we'll take the opportunity to go through them one at a time, look at similarities and differences to systems you're familiar with, and look at how they create the underpinnings of the modern European Union. So here are the institutions that bring the EU forward. The Council of the European Union, the European Council, the European Commission, European Parliament, European Court of Justice, European Court of Auditors, and the European Central Bank. We'll run through these in order and see what we can learn. You'll often hear about the three pillars of the EU, and this is a little bit of an outdated concept at this point, but I think it's actually fairly helpful as we look at the institutions and the evolution of the EU. The first pillar is focused on trade and economic issues, and these are the areas where the member nations have ceded much sovereignty to the European Union and its institutions. Second pillar is security and defense issues, and the third pillar is home and justice issues, where there's much closer cooperation but more retained sovereignty. The EU talks a lot about and thinks a lot about the issue of subsidiarity, also known as devolution, which keeps decisions as close to the local level as possible, at the lowest available level of governance. Remember, we talked about the EU as a transnational system of multi-level governance. And the idea of subsidiary here is that as many things as possible are kept at the lowest or most local possible level of government. And the EU only handles issues of transnational importance, or places where working across the Union or across the single market are critical. The Council of the European Union represents the 27 member nations of the Union, and this is where the national governments are represented. So what I'd really like you to hold on to here is this is where the governments of the member states are represented. They come together in a variety of forms to work on technical issues. The national ministers dealing with any given subject area, whether it's energy or agriculture or home affairs or any of a variety of other topics, that group of ministers, all of the energy ministers, will come together and hold a meeting to work on a particular topic. And so it ends up being a rotating series of high-level meetings working with one topic at a time, hosted in the institution of the Council. You'll often also hear the word concilium used here. That's increasingly popular. And its logo here at the top of the page reflects the building in which the Council is housed. The Council operates with a 6-month rotating presidency, and this is one of these things that made a lot of sense and was fairly straightforward when the Union was 6 members, or at that time the communities had 6 members, and so they rotated every 6 months. Everyone got the opportunity to hold the presidency every 3 years, and it was it just was a fairly easy proposition. With expansion to 12, 15, 25, and beyond, this has become a little bit more challenging, particularly since traditionally the presidency is held in order of accession, but it didn't make a lot of sense that the new countries added, particularly when moving from 15 to 25, 27, 28, of course now again 27, that it would have to wait decades for the chance to become president. So at that point they mixed up the schedule a little bit, and so the upcoming, or the current and then upcoming presidents in 6-month order. Right now it's Germany through the end of 2020, and then Portugal and Slovenia through 2021. Every country is represented in the Council, and the primary mode of decision making is consensus, 100% agreement from every member. The Council passes legislation in co-decision with Parliament, but only the Commission, which we'll talk about in a moment, has the right to author new legislation. This is a very unique feature of the European Union institutions, and we'll talk a lot about that as we go forward. But the Council passes legislation working with Parliament, and we'll talk about Parliament's role also in a few minutes, on the basis of 100% agreement or consensus. On some issues, particularly those of less immediate or urgent importance, a system called QMV, or qualified majority voting, is allowed. And that allows voting with 55% of member states representing over 65% of the population to pass a vote. So it's a double pass system. You need to have votes representing 55% or more of member states and 65% of the population. You can only really determine this with a specific European Council vote calculator to make sure you have the number of member states and the population right. If you just try and do this in your head, you'll probably end up incorrect. And this method has been in place since 2014. The Council doesn't have a clear analog in the US system, so it's sometimes a little bit challenging for people used to the US model of governance to figure out where to place this. The Council holds many roles that we would consider executive roles or part of the executive branch, but those are split with the Commission, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So the critical thing here is that you remember that the Council, or Concilium, is where the member states and their interests are represented in the EU institutions. The European Council, and you need to be a little bit careful about making sure that you use the right nomenclature here. For the Council of the European Union and the European Council have names that are very similar. And what happened was that within the Council of the European Union, when it was the prime ministers or the heads of government who were scheduled to meet rather than a sector minister like energy or defense, when the prime ministers and other heads of government came together, it tended to overwhelm other things that were going on a little bit within the Council of the European Union, and naturally ended up taking a little bit more staff time and had outsized importance relative to other segments. So in the Lisbon Treaty of 2009, the European Council, representing only the heads of government, was broken out as a separate institution. It remains housed within the Council of the European Union, but it is now technically its own separate institution, and that allows more staff, budget, and focus on these incredibly important meetings of the heads of government. The European Council, as the format in which the heads of state meet, or heads of government, excuse me, not heads of state. It meets twice every 6 months by law, but in practice it's a little bit more than that. The current president, who is not one of the members of heads of state, the European Council appoints its own president under its own separate set of rules. We'll talk a little bit about that, is Charles Michel, who's the former Prime Minister of Belgium. The president serves 2.5-year terms, maximum of 2 years. Michel is just beginning his first year, or I guess ending his first year of his first term. And the president's role is to help organize, pull together, and lead the discussion of the European Council. It's a critical role, and it wasn't quite clear when it was established whether this would end up being a powerful executive role or more of a role as a moderator, and it's settled in a little bit into something in between. It's a very powerful position, but it is also not a sort of a strong executive presidency in the mode that someone looking at US or, for example, French government would imagine. I'll just flag one more time to be very, very careful about the nomenclature, that we have the president of the European Council, who is an individual serving a 2.5-year term, and the presidency of the Council of the European Union, which is held by a member state on a rotating 6-month basis. It would be very easy to get off track with these. I'll just note that neither of these should be confused with the Council of Europe, which is a separate intergovernmental organization working on development on the European continent as a whole. So that's Council of Europe is just an entirely separate non-European Union organization. The European Commission is probably the piece of the European institutions that looks most familiar to Americans, and it holds the role of the executives, what we would call departments of energy or Department of Defense or Department of Interior or Department of Agriculture, Department of Education here in the US. Executive body in the sense of the ones who are actually doing the work. Every member state contributes one commissioner for a 5-year term, and they come in all together and arrive and depart as a group, leading the currently set at 33 directorates general, each focused on a particular topic, to execute policy for the EU. It is worth noting that most of the actual policy execution is done at the member state level, and the Commission primarily ends up being an oversight and regulatory body rather than the ones doing the day-to-day work in any particular area, which happens at the level of the state governments. The European Commission has a staff of about 22,000, and again, they are just beginning their 5-year term at the moment. The President of the Commission is proposed by the Council of the European Union, technically elected by European Parliament, and Ursula von der Leyen, who's Germany's former defense minister, has held the role for almost a year now. The European Commission is a little bit unique in that it holds the right of legislative initiative for the European Union. It is the only body that can write and propose the text of legislation and regulations. That right is more commonly held by parliaments or Congress here in the US, but it's been specifically ascribed to the Commission for the EU and the European communities since the beginning, in part to move the right of initiating legislation away from a parliament that might be affected by more day-to-day political concerns, to move it away from the member states, and to put it explicitly in the hands of non-partisan staff members who are really focused on getting the technical aspects right. The upside of this is it means that when the Commission works on legislation, it tends to be very thoughtful, very well organized, and very responsive to the data and science side of things. The downside is it sometimes means that there's a perception that it's a little bit out of touch with what's going on in the public sector and what's going on the political side. It's both an intentional separation and one that occasionally causes challenges and opportunities for the EU in explaining how their policy works to the average citizen. We've talked a little bit about the acquis communautaire, which just means the entire current body of law and regulation and the decisions of the European Court of Justice affecting how those are carried out. It is just the current complete body of European Union law, regulation, and treaty. And one of the jobs of the Commission is to initiate legal action against violators, either individual or entire member states, as part of enforcing the acquis. The Commission manages the budget, represents the Union externally through the European External Action Group, and again makes a lot of sense to those who are familiar with U.S. government models. It's a very, very close match to the executive departments. This is just a quick look at the existing portfolios for the commissioners, ranging from regional policy to trade, environment, energy, digital agenda development, competition. The High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy is a special position. We'll talk a little bit more about that along the way. European Parliament is technically the first institution of the European Union, and this is where the people of Europe are directly represented. There are 751 members of European Parliament, or MEPs, who were elected to 5-year terms. The last set of elections were in May 2019. And Parliament holds ceremonial precedence. It's mentioned first in the treaties and is a critical part of the EU's connection and a democratic connection to the people of Europe. David Sassoli, who's from Italy and a member of the Socialist and Democratic parties at the EU level, is the current president. He's serving a 2.5-year term, maximum of 2, and he's been in that slot since July 2019. Parliament passes laws in the co-decision. You'll hear a lot about co-decision process with the Council. If there are differences in Parliament's view and the Council's view on the proposals of the Commission, conciliation committees work out the differences to the text of the legislation. Parliament's charged with oversight and holds a position very similar to the U.S. Congress in the overall scheme. It looks very familiar, but for Americans, we need to be very, very careful about how closely we match those, because Parliament can't directly propose legislation. As I said, that right of legislative initiative belongs only to the European Commission, and Parliament also doesn't have direct control of the budget in the way that U.S. Congress does, and so doesn't have a direct power of the purse. So here's a visual of decision-making. If we look at Council, Parliament, and Commission holding the traditional 3 sides of a triangle for leadership, Parliament offers opinions, Council has to consult with Parliament, Commission drafts proposals and amends them and sends them to the Council, who then works in co-decision with Parliament to actually enact the legislation. 2 institutions that we'll just bounce off very quickly are the European Court of Auditors, which is responsible for oversight of the finances and looks at expenditures. You do not want to run afoul of the Court of Auditors. And then the European Central Bank manages monetary policy and the euro. The Court of Auditors is based in Luxembourg, and the ECB, the central bank, is based in Frankfurt. Thank you for joining us for this European Union Governance and Policy Challenges lecture, co-funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union and produced by the Center for West European Studies and the EU Center, a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence in the University of Washington's Jackson School of International Studies.